Due Process, winner of 25 regional Emmy Awards, including the 2014 New York Emmys for our coverage of criminal justice and current affairs. Due Process is a presentation of Rutgers School of Law, Newark, and the Edward J. Blaustein School of Planning and Public Policy. Studio facilities provided by the Rutgers ITV Studio, Division of Continuing Studies.
85% of the people stopped by the police in Newark are black, in a city where the black population is 54%.
Claims of bias and brutality by Newark Police, those are long-standing. But detailed charges from the Department of Justice announced by the U.S. Attorney, that was something new. Now, a year and a half later, a federal monitor is about to step in, and a civilian complaint process is about to be launched. A new era for policing in Newark? We'll ask Paul Fishman here on Due Process.
Major funding for Due Process provided by the Fund for New Jersey, supporting informed citizens for an effective democracy. Additional funding from the New Jersey State Bar Foundation and the PSEG Foundation, making things better in our communities.
The Newark Police Department is deeply flawed. That's no secret. And it's more than anecdotal. After decades of charges, the U.S. Department of Justice has made it official. And now, after 18 months of waiting, a consent decree is about to be signed and a federal monitor's in the wings. I'm Raymond Brown.
And I'm Sandra King, and overseeing it all, the Justice Department's man in New Jersey, U.S. Attorney Paul Fishman, charged with tackling terrorism, political corruption, and now police misconduct. He's here to tell us how it's all going to work. But first, a look at how we got here and whether it's realistic at last to hope for real reform.
We also found an organization that is challenged in fundamental ways and has engaged in a pattern and practice of unconstitutional policing in a broad range of areas.
The findings of the 3-year federal study were not much different than what activists have been saying here since the 60s.
No justice! No peace! No justice! No peace!
That problems of police misconduct and racial bias are still fact in Newark, even after nearly half a century of black leadership at City Hall.
Something needs to change, and I think in most departments all over America, there's some level of institutional racism and things that have been happening for decades. A lot of stuff exists either at great extent or residue of it still exists.
Maybe not what the current mayor's father experienced at the hands of police in '67.
I got my head split open, my teeth knocked out. Got sentenced to 3 years in prison with no parole. Yeah, that was unpleasant at the time.
But enough that the ACLU nearly 5 years ago called for a federal civil rights probe, with Paul Fishman and the Department of Justice announcing they'd investigate just 8 months later. And when the findings came in 2014, they were accompanied by the mandate of new federal oversight of policing in Newark.
The Justice Department report found widespread civil rights and civil liberties violations in Newark. Unconstitutional stop and frisk practices, pattern of excessive force, extreme racial disparities in who gets arrested and who gets stopped.
And though the previous administration had resisted federal intervention, the new mayor, sworn in just before Paul Fishman announced those findings, embraces it, even helping to choose the federal monitor.
Clearly, I think it gives the mayor the support that they need to actually go in there and root out the kind of things so it just doesn't look like the mayor has a personal vendetta against the police department or police in general.
And it's a process not confined to Newark. Cleveland, New Orleans, and most recently, Ferguson, Missouri, are just some of the cities that have come under federal scrutiny. subject to the kind of court-enforceable consent decrees that will oversee police in Newark, where the number of stop and frisks per capita far outpace even those in New York City.
85% of the people stopped by the police in Newark are black, in a city where the black population is 54%. So it stands to reason that if the police are stopping people in Newark for impermissible or insufficient reasons, the people who are most likely to have that happen to them are black.
We need to end the fact that up to 75% of all stop and frisks in Newark lack a constitutional basis. I mean, that's outrageous. That means the police department gets it wrong 3 out of 4 times.
And Newark is also about to launch its own oversight of its police. A civilian complaint review board called for by Baraka in his campaign and by his poet-playwright father 50 years earlier.
The federal government is saying, listen, something's wrong and you have to fix it. That gives us the kind of green light to pass to go in and do what we need to do.
Whether we get this right depends on the details of the powers that that civilian complaint review board will have and the reforms that the federal monitor will seek out.
No justice, no peace. No justice, no peace.
Will it be a panacea? Not likely. But after generations of discord between community and police, racial bias and trampled rights, could it make a real difference?
So we turn to the man on whom it may depend, Paul Fishman, U.S. Attorney for New Jersey. Welcome back to Due Process, Paul.
Thank you, Raymond. Nice to see you, Sandra.
Now, Paul, I know you to be a deep thinker in addition to being a United States Attorney. So let me ask you the question that I think is on the minds of many viewers of this process. 3 of the 4 cities where DOJ has found racial disparities in policing, the ones that are mentioned in the report, are cities that have had black political control, at least on and off, for decades. Newark has had consistent black political control in terms of mayors and city councilmen. So the question is, are police departments so insulated from the impact of political culture and democratic accountability that they can have, as Mayor Baraka says, institutional racism at the point of the spear of their work for this long?
Well, let me take a step back from that question, because I think to a certain extent it incorporates a view of what we found that may go a little farther than what we actually found. Our report did not actually conclude that there was racism in the police department and that the stops were actually intentionally
But there's
biased.
a race effect.
There's certainly a race effect, and that's important.
Right.
One of our criticisms is that the way the police department has kept data for many, many, many years doesn't allow anyone to step back and look and figure out why this is going on. What we do know...
But just let me... I don't want to walk away from my question
fine.
deliberately because I've put in an assumption. You're right. But when you have a department like Newark that doesn't keep the data, even though that's the national standard, and where its internal affairs process doesn't look at these kinds of cases, that suggests that there's something deeper than just incidental effect that is not a part of the culture.
That may well be right, but we didn't find that in our findings. What was important for us is to figure out that there is something clearly wrong with the way the department is behaving as an institution.
But you know, I just want to say why I'm pushing this. Citizens who see this report are going to say, this confirms my view that there's an institutional culture that is progressively, or I should say, in a non-progressive way, carrying forward a culture that says we are discriminating on a racial basis.
I get that. What matters to me most of all is that the citizens don't trust the police, and the police are not communicating in the appropriate way with the people they're sworn to protect. The system doesn't work if people don't believe that the people who are sworn to protect them, people who do incredibly dangerous work, are doing it in the right way for the right reasons. The truth is, most of the people I know in law enforcement, the vast majority of cops with whom I come in contact every day at the state, local, and federal level, have taken these jobs for exactly the right reason. They want to protect the public, they want to serve, they want to do something that's good for their communities. And the work that they do, we all know this, is unbelievably dangerous work. I mean, I get up in the morning, I don't put a bulletproof vest on, I don't strap a gun to my ankle. If I'm out late, my wife and my kids want to know what time I'm coming home. They don't wonder if I'm coming home. And we expect a lot of police. We actually expect a lot of police. We expect them to deal with homelessness and drug addiction and people on the streets with weapons and kids who aren't in school and poverty and a whole lot of things for which they may not actually be totally equipped. And they're not fully integrated into a social service structure that will actually give them the backup, the training, and the resources they need to do their jobs fully and effectively. Sometimes the only tool that they've been trained to use is an arrest. And that's not necessarily where we want them to go.
But
and
Paul, excuse me, now you're going to expect them to do all of that while you're looking over their shoulders in a way that is perceived perhaps by the police as less than fond, and you're going to have a police pushback, or are you, where in fact the police will be less enthusiastic about protecting the public? Do you fear that you could wind up like the Newark schools, which were supposed to get cured by state takeover and in fact wound up worse?
Okay, so now you're like totally out of my realm of expertise when you get to the schools. But let me say this:
But
I
you
don't think that you're right, and I don't think you're right for a couple of reasons. First of all, one of the problems with the Newark Police Department for years has been that it is under-resourced. There used to be 1,700 cops patrolling the city of Newark. Now there are south of 1,000, and you can't really do effective community policing. I've talked to Director Venable, now Director Ambrose, before him, Director DeMayo. They all agreed we need more cops on the street to do this work right. They have not been well trained. I talked to supervisors and line officers in the department. They all agree they don't have the training, the policies, the supervision. What this agreement will do, what this consent decree will do, is to force the city, with the mayor's obvious agreement that this is a good thing, will force the city to use the kind of resources it needs to make the police department better. The cops really want that. They recognize that many of the failures we identified are not failures of the police themselves. It's not because these are necessarily bad people, but because they don't have the tools that they need to do their jobs. Now, to be fair, I looked at the video, and it's exactly right. 75% of the stops that we looked at, the police reports did not describe a constitutionally adequate reason for the stop. That's not okay. Whether it's a training issue or a resource issue or an actual intent issue on behalf of the cops, you can't have people being stopped on the streets of Newark without a constitutionally valid reason
and when you
for that
have
happening.
Race effect, because the effect of that is that there's also a disproportionate stoppage of black folks.
Right.
But I realize that we're asking you to respond to questions that go beyond the confines of the report. But it seems to me that has something to do with citizen expectations. If the answer is that we ask police to do so much more than they're prepared to do because we don't deal with the back end, the social justice issues, and if it's true that we underfund the police department, then it strikes me that a monitor and a more open discussion of the failures of the past on race lines aren't going to get us very much progress if there's a deeper systemic problem.
Well, no. So first of all, I think people misapprehend the role of a monitor under these circumstances. There will be a consent decree, as you talked about at the top of the show, that will be a very detailed document, 50 or 60 pages, outlining a variety of ways in which the city has to change its systems in order to come in compliance with federal law. They're going to be how they stop, how they arrest, how they search, what kind of data they have to keep, having an early warning system, having a disciplinary matrix so that police officers know that if two different cops do the same thing, that they're going to be treated the same way by the police department for which they work. There's going to be a revamping of internal affairs, a revamping of use of force policies, all that sort of stuff. The monitor's job is not as an independent investigator to go look for ways in which the police department may also be not up to snuff, but to make sure that the requirements that we're putting in place in this consent decree, which is an agreement between the federal government and the city, the monitor is going to make sure that those things are happening on schedule, in the right way, and that people are actually paying attention to what needs to happen.
But you know that there are many in the rank and file who feel that this reflects poorly on them, that it's not fair, and that they are somehow going to be the victims in all of this.
Well, I'm hoping...
Because you talk to the people at the top, and I talk to rank and file, and I hear a different story.
I talk to both. I've met with the state FOP. I've been to their convention. I've talked to lots of cops that our office works with, so who are involved in individual cases. So I don't think that's entirely right. I do talk to the top brass also, but during the course of our investigation, people in the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice and in my office spent a lot of time with cops on the beat, riding along in their cars, trying to figure out exactly what it was and that made their jobs easier
and you don't hear this
or harder.
That I hear?
I hear some resentment, but I heard the same resentment when the Justice Department signed its consent decree with the state police 15 or 20 years ago. And now people agree, I think pretty universally, that that was a good change for the state police. And I think people recognize that once you give people the tools, the training, and the resources they need to do their jobs right, to do their jobs the way they want to do them, and more importantly, to do the jobs the way the public expects and has a right to have the job done, that actually makes a difference to everybody's morale, in a good way.
And you
So
can
you're
feel
op-
optimistic.
I feel very
I was gonna
optimistic.
say, so you're optimistic that when we revisit this issue, say in 5 years, that there will be a significant decline in the disparities along race lines as well as constitutional violations, and that the citizenry will have at least reason to be more trustful of the police.
I absolutely hope that that's true, and part of that is based on my conversations with other people in other parts of the country who have embarked on the same kind of enterprise. I've talked to you, the Justice Department has now launched almost 24 of these investigations over the course of the last 6 years across the country. And I've talked to my colleagues in Seattle and Los Angeles and New Orleans and Connecticut about how it's worked there. I've just met last month with the chief of police in Seattle, who is coming at the back end of this process. And I think people are pleased, not universally pleased, and maybe not satisfied in the end with having achieved everything, but I do think that there will be a marked improvement.
But it's the scope of your exposure to DOJ's work across a half decade in this area that made me comfortable saying, does this imply that these things exist? Because we've come a long way in our public conversation about race.
Right.
Is due to something that seems to affect police cultures, even when the cultures in the cities around them are changing.
Sure, but I don't think it's, the answer is yes, but I don't think it's limited to police. Implicit bias exists in lots of places in our culture, in law enforcement, among defense lawyers and judges, in our schools and in our workplaces, in big corporations and small.
But when it's the guys and gals who have the monopoly on the use of force and the obligation to protect the constitutional rights, it has a different hue.
But that's exactly why I think this work is so critically important. I think it's very important for us to take a look at the Newark Police Department. We took a pretty deep dive for the 2 or 3 years of this investigation lasted, and now we're going to continue to be on the scene, making sure that the things that we found that were wrong with that department get fixed.
The nuts and bolts of all of this also tie into what the city's doing. You've been working with the mayor, you've been working with community groups. You know that there is a big change coming in internal affairs. The mayor says that will, for the first time, be a non-police lawyer. I'm wondering what you think about that. And you've been working with them on the Civilian Complaint Review Board. Very high expectations on the part of community people who are working on that board, who fear that they will not get what they thought that they were going to get, which is subpoena power. So let me ask you those two questions. Subpoena power, is it even legal for a Civilian Complaint Review Board? And what about having somebody in internal affairs? Is that something that's going to be challenged in court?
Okay, so let me start with the Civilian Complaint Review Board. The agreement in principle that we signed with the city a year and a half ago and the consent decree itself will not dictate a particular form of civilian review. That's typical of the Justice Department consent decrees around the country. We actually believe that it is better for the cities that are being subjected to this kind of consent decree decide for themselves what form of civilian review will work best in that community. There's not one size fits all. Now, the mayor did issue an executive order last year, which he has since revised and is still talking about. There has been some pushback from the unions and from other folks saying that the specific power, subpoena power he wants to give to the board may not be legal. What I would advocate, and what I think is actually will be more comprehensive, is to give the board a variety of powers. To have a Civilian Complaint Review Board that may have subpoena power, that can look at systemic trends in the way police are behaving, can look at internal affairs investigations after the fact and see what they see, to see what kinds of training are necessary. If it turns out that the mayor's proposal to have subpoena power for the Civilian Complaint Review Board, it turns out to be illegal against New Jersey state law and against their collective bargaining agreement, that there's a lot left for the Civilian Complaint Review. I think an all or nothing approach to civilian review is a little dangerous. I don't want to be sitting here a year from now or a year and a half from now having had a court strike that down and be left with no civilian review. I don't think that will be productive.
And will it make a big difference having a civilian running the internal affairs department? And is that legal?
Well, I don't know whether it's legal, and legal comprehends a bunch of different things. There's New Jersey state law, there's the civil service law,
Can it survive a
and there's the
challenging state court?
there's the collective bargaining agreements too, in which I am not an expert. But my view is this: however the city fixes its internal affairs department, it needs fixing. The way the internal affairs investigations were done before was, in large respects, shoddy. Honestly, investigations weren't completed. They didn't interview everybody who should have been interviewed. Police officers got too much the benefit of the doubt, and civilians not enough. Sometimes civilians were getting Miranda warnings when they weren't appropriate for people who were in that setting. And as a result, the results that were being issued by internal affairs didn't have credibility either with the department or with the citizens. And so that needs to be fixed. And whoever runs that department, I think the mayor understands, I know Director Ambrose understands, and we understand that if you don't have a credible, thorough internal affairs department, you're not in a position as an organization to make sure that people who work there are doing all the things that we want them to do in the right way.
Internal affairs is its own set of dynamics and challenges, race aside. When you add the fact that in a number of the cities you mentioned, failure to follow up on race-based complaints was a particular problem, and in Newark, lack of statistics make it harder to give it context. Right. So are you optimistic that that part of this dynamic, which is pretty complex, which is having an entity investigate itself, is going to work and bring about change that's part of this larger project?
I don't think it will be enough by itself, but I do think it's an important part. I mean, internal affairs investigations are part of the way lots of organizations look at themselves and look at people who have done things that may not result in criminal charges, for example. But
the Miranda warning issue is common. I mean, I've had many people come to me who went in as complainants and were given warnings.
Right, and the explicit policy is you can't do that, and you shouldn't do that, because that all of a sudden puts the complainant on the defensive in a way that's not appropriate and not constructive. And so that has to end. And I'm actually hopeful, again, this is one of the things that the monitor will be looking at on an ongoing basis, is have the internal affairs investigations changed? Are people doing them in the right way? Are they being supervised correctly? Are they being reviewed correctly at the right levels throughout the department?
And with, oh my goodness, about 3.5 minutes left, would you like to make some news on due process today and tell us who the federal monitor is going to be?
I would not. I would not like to make news on that score today.
And speaking of not wanting to comment on things, there's a lovely piece of video that's floating around the internet from NJ.com. I bet you've seen it, Laura.
I have seen it.
Let's roll it.
Did anyone else besides these three know about the plan?
I'm not going to comment on what other people may or may not have known. I'm not going to comment on what we're working on that's related to this or anything else. Again, I'm not going to comment on what people did or did not know. No. Sorry. I think I answered before that I'm not going to answer that. The answer is I'm not going to tell you. No, I can't. I mean, I can, but I won't. I'm not going to comment on whether anybody is going to be further investigated with connection with this or any other matter ever.
And since I'm not shy, that was about Bridgegate. Let me ask you, is there still an investigation in which Governor Christie might still be looked at?
Well, so let me first say I'm disturbed to notice that I was wearing the same tie at the Bridge press conference that I was wearing at the Newark Police Department press conference, but not today, although it's a bit of the same hue. So, you know, Sandra, I'm not going to talk about who the unindicted co-conspirators are, where the investigation might or might not go. We never do that. And the reason, and I think it's very important for people to understand why we don't do that. We are not free-ranging investigators like reporters or like legislative committees who can take evidence and issue reports or write stories on a standard that's something less than beyond a reasonable doubt. Our charge at the end of the day is actually very narrow. We look at what people have done. We try to figure out who's responsible for something, and then we try to figure out if we have proof beyond a reasonable doubt that those actions violated federal law. If they did, and if we are convinced of that, and if we can prove it to a jury, we bring a charge. But beyond that, we don't ever comment on who we investigate, who we don't, whether and why we haven't charged. Because honestly, we investigate 3,000 people a year. We charge maybe 600 or 700, and for the other 23 or 2,400, it wouldn't
may or
be
may
fair.
not be answerable.
Yeah.
We know your mandate includes terrorism. There's a guy running around the country, your predecessor, saying he fought terrorism every day as your predecessor. Do you fight terrorism every day?
Well, what we do is we look at individuals who may be engaged in conduct that are a threat to the national security. They could be people who want to travel overseas to go join ISIL and the Caliphate. They may be people who are going to be radicalized here by what they read or the tweets that they get. They may be people who are trying to come back into the country, either from Syria or Iraq or somewhere else.
So in the ambit of your job responsibility, it would be fair to say that you do have terrorism-related activity every day?
We certainly have terrorism. I mean, look, most of the investigative responsibility belongs to the FBI. We work hand in glove with them on those cases. And so national security, protecting the homeland, is the highest priority of the Department of Justice.
Does this mean you'll be running for president one day?
There is not a chance that I'm going to be running for anything after this job.
So there are so many areas that we have not gotten to, and I'm being told that we've got 30 seconds left. In that 30 seconds, tell me 5 years from now where we will be with the Newark Police.
I hope that where the Newark Police Department is that it's an organization that has the resources and training to do its job exactly the right way. We have a right to expect, as citizens, as members of the public, that the people who take an oath to protect us do their jobs according to the Constitution of the United States. And our goal is to make sure not just the Newark Police Department, but that every police department understands that that's its obligation.
And Paul, that is the last word for now, with our thanks to you. But this story is just getting started, so we will revisit as the leadership, oversight, and reforms are rolled out.
And we hope you'll revisit Due Process every week on 13 and NJTV. For more on law and justice, visit us on Facebook or stop by our website where all our episodes are available on demand. For Sandy, producer Tanya Bentley, and all of us here, I'm Raymond Brown. Thanks for watching.
Want even more insight on law and justice? Become a fan of Due Process on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter and watch us on demand on YouTube.